We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Beis Amid Beis Meseches Nazir. This is Nazir Daf 52b. And the previous Amid, the Gemara asked, when we say in the Mishnah that a Shidra and Gilgolis, a spine and a skull, convey Tumah, did that mean the spine and the skull together, or were those two separate cases, the spine or the skull can convey Tumah? And the Gemara is in the middle of bringing a proof from a Tosefta, because the Tosefta lists 6 cases in which Rabbi Akiva retracts his opinion. And so the Gemara says, V'salka daitach o Shedra o Gilgolis. Now if you think that the spine and the skull are two separate cases, it's either the spine or the skull. So Hani Shiva Havin. So it's actually 7 cases that are listed in that Tosefta, not 6. So it must be that it's actually combined. It's got to be the spine and the skull together in order for it to be 6 cases. And the Gemara answers, Ki Katani, no, when did we say 6? Kol Hecha de Pligi Ole Rabim. We're talking about situations where Rabbi Akiva argued with a majority. However, one of the cases in the list, La Fuke Etzem Kisaora, that actually excludes the cases of a bone the size of a barley, even though that's in the list. That was not one of the 6 cases. The Yachidu de Poligole, because there was actually a machlokas that he had with another individual, and so therefore the Gemara is saying even if Shedra and Gilgolis are separate, it's not going to be 7 cases, because we don't count the case of Etzem Kisaora. And the Gemara says, the Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Etzem Kisaora Shenechlek L'Shnayim. If you have a bone the size of a barley and it's split in 2, Rabbi Akiva Metame, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Metar. Rabbi Akiva says Tame, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says Tar. So you see that he's arguing with a Yachid, he's arguing with an individual. If you want, I could say another answer. We can eliminate a different case and say that Shedra and Gilgolis are separate cases. Ki Katani, Avram and Ameis. When we talk about 6 cases, we're talking about cases of limbs from the dead. Avram and Achai, Lo Katani, but a situation of a limb from a living person that doesn't count among the number, and so therefore that's why we have 6 cases, even if Shedra and Gilgolis are separate cases. If you want, I could say another answer. Ki Katani Kolecha, the Nazir Megaleach Alohilo. When we talk about 6 cases, we're talking about the 6 cases where a Nazir would shave because of Tumas Ohel. Lafuke Etzem Kisaora, that would exclude the case of a bone the size of a barley. The low, in that case, it's not Tumas Ohel. There's no Tumas Ohel in that situation. If you want, I could say another answer. When we talk about 6 cases, it's 6 cases in which Rabbi Akiva retracted. That excludes the case of a quarter lug of blood. Actually, Rabbi Akiva did not retract his opinion in that case. Because Rabbi said to Bar Kapara, you should not list the case of Revias Dam as one of the cases in which Rabbi Akiva retracted. Because Rabbi Akiva maintained his position in that case. Furthermore, there's a pasuk that supports what he's saying. It says in plural nafshos meis, and we understand that to mean that if you have a revius of blood that comes from two corpses, that would be tameh. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says further, his entire life, I know he said that it was tameh, I know he didn't retract. Now if he retracted after he died, so says Rabbi Shimon, that I don't know. The Gemara says that was an inappropriate comment that Rabbi Shimon made, and therefore he took upon himself some fasting. Tanan, it was taught, Hushchuru Shinov Mibnei Tani Yosef, that his teeth became black because of all of the fasting he did to repent for that comment. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come in here a proof from the following Brisa, the Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa. Beis Shammai Omer and Beis Shammai say, Rova Atzamos min ha'atzamim o mishnayim o mishlosha. When we talk about the fact that a quarter of a kav of bones conveys tumah, it can come from 2 or 3 bones. Beis Hillel Omer and Beis Hillel say, Rova min ha'gavia, me'rov ha'binyan o me'rov ha'minyan. It's a quarter kav of bones from the corpse. It can come from the majority of the structure of the corpse, of the bones of that corpse, or it can come from a majority of the number of bones from that corpse. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Yoshua says, Yicholani lasos divrei Beis Shammai v'divrei Beis Hillel ka'echad. I can interpret the words of Beis Shammai and the words of Beis Hillel that they're really saying the same thing. Beis Shammai Omer, because Beis Shammai are saying mishnayim o mishlosha, when they say that it comes from 2 or 3 bones, o mishnei shokayim v'yarek echad, what they mean is it comes from either 2 shins and 1 thigh, or mishnei yarchayim v'shok echad, or from 2 thighs and 1 shin. Hoel v'rov gova shaladam migova, and some have the gears of hoel v'rov binyano shaladam migova. The point is that is the majority of the structure of the bones in terms of the height of the person. So if it comes from those particular bones, that's the same as coming from rov binyan. That's what Beis Shammai was actually saying. Beis Hillel Omer and Beis Hillel say min hagavia o me'rov binyan o me'rov minyan, when they say it comes either from the majority of the bone structure of the majority of the actual bones. They're talking about the fact that there are many small bones throughout the hands and the feet, and if it comes from the majority of the bones in the body, a collection of the majority of bones, you have this quarter kav of bones, so that conveys tumah. And the Brisa continues, Shammai Omer, Shammai says, Afilu etzem min hashedro min hagilgolas, even if it's a bone from the spine or from the skull. And the Gemara understands that if Shammai is saying the spine or the skull, so the same is true in general when we say that the spine or the skull, they convey tumah, so it means the spine or the skull, it doesn't mean the spine and the skull. But the Gemara says, Shani Shammai demachmir, you can't bring a proof from Shammai. It could be in general that Shammai is strict, and therefore he's strict over here as well. When we're talking about a quarter of a kav of bones, he's also being strict, and he's saying it's the spine or the skull, but it could be the standard shita would be, the Chachamim would say that's not the case. It has to be the spine and the skull together. The Gemara says, "Lifshut minat taima de Beis Shammai demachmer." Well, why don't we answer as follows? If Beis Shammai, if they're being strict, harabbanan adikor shedra vigolgolas. Maybe the Rabbanan, on the contrary, they're the ones that say they're lenient and they say it has to be the spine and the skull from the fact that Shammai says it's the spine or the skull. In other words, we can deduce that the Rabbanan are certainly more lenient than Shammai. But the Gemara says, "Lo, no, that's not the case. Adkan lo pligi Rabbanan le de Shammai ela be'etzem echad da'asim min hashedra umin hagilgolas." The Rabbanan only argue with Shammai in a situation of a bone that comes from the spine or a bone that comes from the skull. So in that situation, again, Shammai says it comes from either the spine or the skull, and the Rabbanan say it has to come from a combination of the two. Aval hecha di'ise beine, but it could be when you're talking about an entire skull or an entire spine. Afilu chadam in hon, it could be they agree it's either or, either the skull or the spine is enough to convey the tumah. And Rashi explains, Tashma, Beis Shammai Omer, I'm coming here a proof from the Brisa. Beis Shammai say, Rova atzamos minho atzamos, when we're talking about a quarter kav of bones, it's from the bones, Sha'amru Shemetamin Ba'oel. Again, when they say this quarter kav of bones is Metame Ba'oel Umazalin Bishlishi, and you have to sprinkle on the third and seventh day to purify, Kagon Shaba Mishnei atzamos or Mishlosha atzamos, Avalum Me'atzam Echad. The point is, it has to come from 2 bones or 3 bones, a combination, but it cannot come from just 1 bone. That's Beis Shammai's opinion. Ubeis Hillel Omer, Rova atzamos Sha'amru min hagavia, Bisman Shuba me Rov habinyan o me Rov haminyan. Beis Hillel say no, that quarter kav of bones has to come either from a majority of the structure, of the bone structure of the body, or it has to come from the majority of the number of bones in the body. Aval mishare varm she'ein Rov binyan o Rov minyan, but if it doesn't qualify as Rov binyan or Rov minyan, eino metame ba'oel. It's not going to be metame ba'oel. And then the Gemara said, Rabbi Yoshua said that really Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are the same, Mishnei Shokayim v'Yerech Echad, because all Beis Shammai meant was if it comes from 2 shins and 1 thigh, Gimel Eivarim, those are the 3 limbs, Ke Beis Shammai v'Yehei Ben, Rov Binyan, that is considered Rov Binyan. Ubeis Hillel Omer me Rov HaMinyan, and Beis Hillel was giving a case of Rov HaMinyan, Avolo Mishar Eivarim, Harei Yachol Eskayim Divrei Beis Hillel. How can we understand Beis Hillel? Kamo b'mifrikei Yadayim v'Raglayim, you're talking about the small bones in the hands and the feet, Sheyehei Behen Rov Minyan, that's going to be a majority of the number of bones in the body, Gimel Eivarim ke Beis Shammai, and it's also going to be 3 Eivarim, as Beis Shammai said, that's going to encompass 3 Eivarim, so it could be, again, that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are in line with one another. And then Shammai Omer, then Shammai himself says, Rova atzamos sha'amru, when we talk about the quarter kav of bones, afilu haba me'etzem echad metame bo'el, even if it comes from just 1 bone, it's metame bo'el, umay me'etzem echad, what does it mean from 1 bone? Kago indasi min hashedra o migagolas, meaning it comes either from the spine or from the skull, even that's enough according to Shammai. And then the Gemara again assumed that the Rabbanan argue with Shammai, and they would say it has to be the Shedra and the Golgolas, but the Gemara said even if that is the case, even if the Rabbanan say it comes from the Shedra and the Golgolas, but if the Shedra and the Golgolas are whole, so then it could be either or, it could be the Shedra or the Golgolas. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama asks the following question, Rova atzamos min shedra v'golgolas mai. What would be the halacha in terms of a nazir if it was a quarter kav of bones from the shedra and the golgolas from the spine and the skull? What would be the halacha? Ki katani chatzi kav atzamos. When it says in our Mishnah doesn't talk about a quarter of a kav of atzamos. It actually talks about a half a kav of atzamos. We say again, if it's a half a kav of atzamos coming from Rov binyan or Rov minyan, so then we say the nazir shaves. So hechadika mishare varav. That's maybe because it's coming from the other limbs. Aval min shedra v'golgolas to chamiri, but when we're talking about the spine and the skull, which are stricter, so maybe afilu rova atzamas, maybe even a quarter of a kav of bone that comes from there is enough to make the nazir shave. Odil maloshna, or maybe it makes no difference. Maybe we don't say a quarter of a kav in that situation. Amar Rava says, Tashma, come in here the following proof. Hashedra v'hagolgolas. The Mishnah talks about a full spine and a full skull. V'sal kadaitach rova atzamas da'asim in shedra v'golgolas. And if you're going to say, and if you think that a quarter kav of bones that comes from the shedra and the golgolas, chamer is so strict, so listen al rova atzamas haba min hashedra v'chulu. It should have said even a quarter kav that comes from the spine. Why does it say that they have to be whole? And Tosas explained, Boy Rami Bar Chama Rova Atzamos Mishedra Om Megolgolas Mai. Again, if you have a quarter kav Atzamos from the spine or from the skull. What's the halacha? Mi'amrinan, do we say ki katani b'masnisin dechatzi kav atzamas the nazir megaleach? In our Mishnah it says that a half a kav of bones the nazir shaves could go into dasi misharei varim. That's talking when it comes from other limbs. Could go in merov habinyan, like we said, rov binyan or aminyan or rov minyan. Aval mishedra v'gulgolas dechamiri tevei. When it comes to the spine and the skull, which are stricter, afilu rova atzamas haba mehen megaleach alein nazir. Then even if it's a quarter kav that comes from them, the nazir would shave. Or dilma lo shnar, maybe it makes no difference. Amar Rav, and then Rava says tashma hashedra v'hagulgolas dekatani b'masnisin. It says in our Mishnah the spine and the skull. It says in our Mishnah the nazir megaleach alein, that the nazir shaves. Now the kasal kadai Tosfos points out right now the Gemara thinks the lek shedra v'gulgolas the less bohen rova atzamas. There's no such thing as a spine or a skull that doesn't have a quarter kav of bone. So if that's the case, every full spine or skull has a quarter kav. So you should have just said a quarter kav. V'lo have ben rova atzamas lo megaleach, and if it doesn't have a quarter of a kav, you're not going to shave. Well, hachi parach. That's why the Gemara asks. V'sal kadai rova atzamas dasi mishedra v'gulgolas chamir. If you think it's so strict by a quarter kav that comes from the spine and the skull, listening to Masnis and Rova atzamas haba min hashedra v'gulgolas. It should have said that. It should have said a quarter kav that comes from them. V'lam ali d'tani Masnis and hashedra v'gulgolas the mashma dafke kashen shleimin. Why does it say in the Mishnah the spine and the skull sounds like they have to be whole? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph.